Developed nations at the Cop26 summit in Glasgow are urged to raise their climate goals and provide more financial support to vulnerable countries. Details of the draft deal in this report.
The anger and the impatience of the world.
The British hosts of the Cop26 UN climate conference in Glasgow have proposed that countries raise their ambitions to slash greenhouse gas emissions by next year, in a draft political decision that will be negotiated over the next 3 days. Climate experts and activists warn of a yawning gap between current pledges and the emissions cuts needed to prevent a full-blown climate crisis. The first draft of the political decision, which the United Nations released on Wednesday, asks countries to revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets in their nationally determined contributions, so as to align with the Paris Agreement temperature goal by the end of 2022. That would force countries to set tougher climate targets next year, a key request from countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Countries agreed under the Paris Accord to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to try to cap it at 1.5 degrees. Scientists say crossing the 1.5 degree threshold would unleash even worse sea level rises, floods, droughts, wildfires and storms, and some of the damage might be irreversible. The draft also urged countries to speed up efforts to end fossil fuel subsidies, though it set no fixed date. That proposal could face pushback from big energy producers.
You must have your own response, sir.
The text also dodges poorer countries' demands for assurances that rich countries, whose greenhouse gas emissions are largely responsible for climate change, will provide far more money to help them cope with climate change and cut CO2 emissions. Greenpeace dismissed the draft as an inadequate response to the climate crisis, calling it, quote, a polite request that countries maybe, possibly, do more next year.
The world's 2 largest emitters of carbon dioxide have agreed to ramp up cooperation to fight climate change. The US-China deal includes protecting forests and a pledge from Beijing to phase out its coal consumption in 5 years from 2026. Then the agreement, Washington sidelined some disputes with Beijing, such as humanitarian issues like China's treatment of ethnic Uyghurs.
The United States and China have no shortage of differences, but on climate, cooperation is the only way to get this job done. Together, we set out our support for a successful COP26, including certain elements that will promote ambition. But let me be clear, this declaration is a step that we can build on in order to help close the gap.
For the European Union's climate policy chief, the breakthrough deal gave room for hope and criticisms. Climate commitments at the summit have so far fallen short of.
It's really encouraging to see that those countries who were at odds in so many areas have found common ground on what is the biggest challenge humanity faces today. It shows that also the US and China know this subject transcends other issues, and it certainly helps us here at COP to come to an agreement.
The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, meanwhile urges COP26 participants not to shun any particular energy source in the fight against climate change. The group insists innovations and technology can address greenhouse gas emissions without swearing off oil and gas. That's as it warns, switching off both oil and gas can cut off nearly 53% of the global energy mix and lead to spikes in the fuel, electricity, and coal markets. It also says aggressive moves away from fossil fuels can be costly, especially to poorer nations. The OPEC's arguments are clashed with efforts by the summit's British host to secure ambitious pledges by cutting fossil fuel consumption.
In other news, Filipinos in Macau warned against organizing or joining public gatherings without a permit from local authorities. That's after reports surfaced some Filipinos there were assembling in public areas to show their support for a Philippine politician. The Philippine Consulate General in Macau reminds them, especially those working in the gambling hub, that any violation of the law could lead to the termination of their employment and permit to stay. In business, Fitch Solutions raises its 2021 growth forecast for the Philippines following the country's better-than-expected third-quarter GDP reading. From 4.2%, it now sees the Philippine economy growing 4.5% this year, but it slashed its 2022 growth forecast to 6.5% from 6.8%. Fitch cites the delayed recovery of the tourism sector as among the headwinds for growth next year, but it says there are signs of continued recovery in the fourth quarter of this year, with an expected increase in domestic activity as government vaccination drive gains pace. The Philippine economy grew 7.1% in the third quarter. Government estimates growth this year to settle within 4 to 5%.
The Philippines books $812 million in net inflows of foreign direct investments in August. That's nearly 20% higher from $677 million in the same period last year. But it's a 35% drop from July's $1.2 billion. For the first 8 months of the year, FDI net inflows reached $6.4 billion. The expansion in August FDI was driven by non-residents' net investments in debt instruments, but reinvestment of earnings contracted and equity capital withdrawals rose as investors remained cautious in August when Metro Manila reverted into the strictest form of lockdown.
Turning now to some economic data releases in the U.S. Inflation in the country jumped to a 30-year high in October as food and gasoline prices continue to rise. Details in this report.
A key measure of U.S. inflation out Wednesday showed consumer prices in October surged at their fastest pace in more than 30 years. The biggest sticker shocks came from food and gasoline, and the data signaled prices could continue to climb painfully higher well into next year as demand roars back, but supply chains remain snarled. The U.S. Labor Department said the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, rose 0.9% last month after gaining 0.4% in September. Compared with 12 months ago, the CPI accelerated 6.2%. That's the largest year-on-year advance since November 1990 and followed